which I should say, just to let you know, it is not recording yet, but it is recording now. So just fair warning, so.
We are recording now. If at any point you need me to turn off the camera or anything, stop recording, let me know. Otherwise, we've got it going. I will forget that I'm recording, but we are. So, yeah, we have permission. Are me or John supposed to say something else now?
Oh, yes, would. So our my co-host is detained at the moment. Do we? I'm so sorry.
I'm keeping an eye too. I'm letting people in with Wild Abandon.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Yeah. Do you both want to start talking about the book? Or what did you have planned?
Yeah, we thought if y'all wanted to say anything, or we certainly can, just, very quickly, kind of how the book came into being. Honestly, we were sitting waiting for Adventure Time to come on many years ago, and suddenly this new cartoon popped up, and we were like, oh, well, we'll watch it. It's fine, whatever. Yeah, fine. And then all of a sudden we were like, oh, wait, this might be, oh, yes. And then that turned into, our fascination turned into, hey, why don't we propose a book? And all of these wonderful people came on board, came together really well. We had the fantastic range of things that we saw in all of the proposals, because there is so much to the show. There's so much more in the show than just the surface stuff, the things dealing with gender and identity and things like that, that there was all this other fantastic stuff going on too, that it ended up moving from being a collection that we'd originally thought was probably primarily going to interrogate the gender and sexuality politics of the show to something much, much, much larger than that. And yeah, and then the book came out and we shut down the world. Yay, team.
Do you want to talk to us a little bit about how you gathered the team, or just the range of people in the book?
Yeah, well, they're all here. Everyone wave if you're in the book. Yeah, it's the before times are so vague. John, you probably remember better than me, but we put out a call. We didn't know, well, actually, I guess I've known Ellery for quite a while, but other than that, didn't know anyone in it. And we were like, oh my God, we're not getting any responses. We're not getting any responses. And then we got a bunch of stuff all at one time. But we just, we went through the call for papers, got great reception. I think some of you are friends of friends, and which is how we were connected and everything like that. But yeah, this just started as a, your standard call for papers and turned into, John, feel free to say more.
I think you give a very apt summary. I guess I could add that. So, we sort of, since we had such a good range of topics, we sort of left our chapter until, we sort of had solidified everything else. And, it was like, all right, what's left? So that's how we ended up with, what we'll be talking about a little later, which is conspiracy theories, which, seems, it's only been 2 years since it's, since we wrote the first draft, but it seems very different topic now. It might be a different article if I had written it like now, but.
And I think actually a lot of us are, probably a lot of us are seeing this with our chapters, as with probably all of our academic work, that the world we live in now, our critical work responds to it so much more differently. I mean, John and Joseph know that my other field of scholarship is I work on vampires as a metaphor for contagion and the way that people are afraid of contagion and like won't wear masks around vampires and stuff like that. So yeah, like an editor keeps asking, hey, how's that coming? And I'm like, I can't think about that. It's real people aren't wearing masks. So maybe that's something we can talk about after we've all introduced our topics a little, is, the question of how would your chapter have changed if you had written it now, if you had written it this year instead, if at all, if it would have changed.
I mean, we can also think about maybe, I think the movie, like when we were finishing, like sending it off to be printed, basically, like the movie had just been out. So there's just time to kind of like throw in a couple of footnotes. And then there was the whole follow-up mini, future season. So, that's also something maybe we can talk about in the Q&A.
Okay. I believe, James is here. James, are you here? Oh, hi, James.
I am here. I am here and audible, apparently. Yes, maybe. Yes. Good. Okay. Hi. All right.
Hi,
so am I just doing look, hi, welcome to this weird format for the faculty lecture series crossover event for representation in the Steven universe. And so like we're, I guess, kindred spirits in a weird way, because we all had a big thing we were excited to do that sort of got sidelined by the pandemic. And we wanted to come together and try to do something that felt like a book launch event, try to provide a space to at least promote the project and talk a bit with the project and its creators. And so we're really grateful to be able to use the faculty lecture series space to do that. And so thank you to the authors for coming. I unfortunately won't be able to stay for too long. I am not done with student conferencing, because that's what my week looks like. But I just wanted to welcome you all and thank you all for coming, and to remind you all that this will be on the English department's newly implemented YouTube channel. So if you miss any part of this conversation, you'll be able to sort of catch up on it later. And so thank you all so much for coming and for being a part of this.
Great. So shall we do introductions or move into the...
Did we want to just have people introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their chapter in chapter order?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Well, just in case y'all haven't memorized your placement in the book, Jake.
Okay, great. So yeah, my name is Jake Petrie. I'm a PhD student at Concordia University in Montreal. So I guess I'm just going to take about 5 minutes here to go through what my chapter is. So first of all, thanks to John and Leah for, first of all, putting the book together and then bringing us all together today. It's nice to put some faces to the names that I've seen in the book. So my chapter is kind of, we were just kind of talking about, my chapter is about a specific time and a specific place, which was basically the mid to late 2010s and Tumblr. So by analyzing kind of both the particularities of Steven Universe and also the platform of Tumblr, I tried to basically make some kind of sense not only of how fandom works on different social platforms, but also what the kind of political implications of these interactions might be. So just very briefly to go over, what I go through, I kind of start by exploring the queerness of the show's narrative and aesthetics to kind of help position myself within a meeting between queer politics, identities, and methodologies. I kind of go through how animation, for example, as we know, is always endlessly malleable, and I inevitably connect that to the fluidity of identity and sexuality, and kind of trace this very brief historical lineage from Yogi Bear and Boo Boo to Pinky and the Brain to SpongeBob and Patrick. Then I kind of move into talking about some of the actual aspects of the show, like fusion, and how that's kind of part of these deliberate strategies in the show to explore different queer relationships. And so with that kind of in place, I turn to the real object, I guess, of the chapter, which is the show's audience. And basically how the audience is kind of this, it makes Steven Universe operate as this kind of liminal text, and its appeal to broad demographics, especially in terms of age, as we can see from the people who are part of this book. And so then, as we think about how fandoms are pathologized in the media, like in My Little Pony or Rick and Morty or whatever, it's kind of become increasingly urgent, I think, to understand the practices of how these fandom actually exist and operate, particularly online. And so Steven Universe kind of stood out to me when I was first watching it and kind of trying to understand what it was doing to me as a kind of explicitly queer series for children that kind of challenges assumptions about fandoms, and about what the political implications of them might be. And so then I kind of move into talking about Tumblr and how it kind of once existed, where it was kind of understood as this realm for social justice warriors, and scholars like Angela Nagel and others kind of see it as this directly, if politically oppositional, parallel to far-right trolls on 4chan or something like that. And so I was kind of coming at it from where I don't agree with that conception entirely, but I kind of find it to be, kind of overly simplistic and largely presented in bad faith. But it does kind of orient us towards the kind of collective affects that circulate on platforms like Tumblr, and how fandom is kind of intensely personalized and internalized. And kind of, so it's no surprise really that fan communities are routinely, inundated with harassment and bullying and things like that, just as often as they facilitate community building and the kind of shared intimacy of what fandom, provides. So kind of put simply, the sense of ownership that a fan feels over the thing that they love is kind of a way of taking ownership over themselves and the world around them. And so the stakes are even higher in that process for those who are in the throes of figuring out their own identities, or for marginalized communities in particular. And so in this kind of mid to late 2010s period, Tumblr kind of offered a general lack of rules. It didn't index anything. It embraced people being anonymous or pseudonymous. It didn't care if you were sharing nudity. It didn't really care about copyright. It didn't care if you connected your account to your real identity or to any kind of offline network at all. And so in a social environment online that is dominated by platforms that are only interested in those things and are only interested in the, marketable data that they're able to collect and measure and archive and sell, Tumblr felt like something different, and it kind of offered a freedom through these allowances that Steven Universe fans, but all kinds of fans, all kinds of fandoms congregated there because of this. And so in my chapter, I kind of try to note that any fandom, particularly one as passionate as this one on a place that's as open-ended as Tumblr, is going to have positive and negative examples, and everything in between, and things that don't register in this kind of positive negative binary at all. And so, kind of what you guys were pointing to in terms of how we would rethink it now versus when we wrote it, I don't know, an hour, a year and a half, whatever ago. I kind of have to say that in the last year and a half or so, I've kind of felt a kind of growing cynicism that I don't think my chapter really reflects about all of this, because at the time I was kind of optimistic still about how social platforms, coupled with media objects like Steven Universe and the kind of socio-political projects that the fans were interested in, I thought that could maybe sustain real projects of change. And I kind of suggested that the good and the bad in the chapter are all necessary components of that kind of movement. I felt that fan investment, identity formation, political sensibility could all kind of come together for a time on Tumblr, or other online spaces, but in this particular case, Tumblr, that could kind of engender some kind of real action in the world as I saw it. But since then, as Tumblr has kind of essentially ceased to exist, at least in that form, as I've watched how social platforms continue to prioritize financialization over all else, as I've watched the pandemic strengthen the control that these tech firms have on everyone, but especially on marginalized groups, and as I've seen at the same time our notion of publics and communities be challenged in these environments that seem inhospitable to these things, I've kind of begun to question the investment I make in the chapter and elsewhere in my work in these kind of utopian ideas of how technology can be used to make a difference in conjunction with these kinds of texts. And so I guess, just to wrap up, I could really use some of Stephen's optimism right now. So maybe, some of you other folks can bring me back into that fold. But yeah, I'll just leave it right there for now.
I was actually trying to find something on Tumblr yesterday, and all I could actually come up with was, oh my God, I don't understand Tumblr. So I don't know if that means, I'm older than I think I am, or, it's changed that much. But unless people have any objections or have a very specific question they want to ask right now, I think we'll just move through the collection and then we can come to questions / discussion amongst us all at the end. So if people are cool with that, we will move on to Kevin.
Thanks. My name is Kevin Cooley. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a PhD candidate at UF, and my chapter was Drawing Queerness Forward, Fusion, Futurity, and Steven Universe. And the question I was really interested in asking here is what the exact relationship between animation on the level of form, materiality, and medium specificity has to do with Steven Universe's engagement with queerness. I think often when we talk about this word representation, right, we talk about it as a storytelling mechanism, as if representation was simply a matter of, do we feature characters from X marginalized community, and are they depicted responsibly? Which is great, and I'm glad that that's a conversation that exists. But often I think we can limit representation when we only think of it that way, as something that doesn't necessarily think about materiality and it doesn't think about medium specificity. And I believe that representation as a conversation, it can consider those things. So in short, I think the goal of my piece was really to complicate the notion of representation in a way that I think will ultimately benefit the cause of representation. And to sort of put a too long didn't read on that, I want to argue that Steven Universe treats representation as a verb and challenges us to treat it as a verb rather than a noun. And I think animation is really the key here that allows us to see how that is happening. So as far as Steven Universe itself is concerned, the question I'm interested in is this: what does the graphic articulation of cartooning, right, that verb of representation, the actual style, process, and results of cartooning itself, do to mobilize queer sexuality? For me, the obvious place to start in this conversation then, if we're talking about graphic articulation and style in a certain sense, was around the topic of being off-model, which, seeing as we're all in this book, I think we probably heard the conversations about that, which to me has always been surprising. I don't understand why anyone has an issue with the shows being off-model, because if you have that problem stylistically, I don't see how you could be on board ideologically with the show is trying to do. It seems to me a stylistic advantage that rhymes with the ideological content of the show. The gem's queerness for me, right, does not come from this ability to perfectly represent some kind of platonic or singular form of lesbianism or any other kind of queer sexuality by a literal template, right? A model, which is what detractors want. The way I'm reading this is that the queerness comes from their resistance to these models. The show finds a political energy in this malleability of the Tex Avery brand of animation that, in other spheres and in other times would have been apolitical or even drawing from political causes we wouldn't want to represent. where bodies can move as the animator pleases and aren't subjected to the limits of models. Garnet literally says to us at one point, right, that this queer active fusion is made possible by these bodies that are made of absence and not presence, which is something I'm going to say a lot about down the line, who, as Garnet says, in this almost borderline metafictional moment, can turn into light, the literal material of animation, right? Light, color, sound. The cartoon bodies, Garnet explains, are composed of more absence than presence. They can do things like fuse and defy the laws of photorealistic physics because they're not articulated as thoroughly as a photorealistic image, and because they can, as Garnet says, turn into light. They're woman, but not woman. Stephen is a boy, but not a boy. Stevani is a genderqueer person, but also an amalgam of colors, lines, and sounds that stand in for the futural possibility of some kind of sexual relations or identity position that can't be vocalized or are not easily vocalized in a present moment. So in this way, I'm seeing Steven Universe as arguing that animation renders the unsayable and the undoable viewable, right? I think it's important, though, to acknowledge that a lot of the foundational scholarship in cartooning has actively discouraged this reading of absence mattering, of bodies that are not perfectly rendered in a photorealistic image mattering. If you look at works like McCloud, right? Scott McCloud, Understanding Comics, says a form of amplification through simplification happens in comics and cartooning, where we strip down an image to its essential meaning, where an artist can simplify the meaning in a way that realistic art can't. Gronstein, the reduction of the utterable to a statement mobilizes in the image only the elements directly concerned with the narrative process. Tamaki Saito, impoverishment of visual information in anime-style images is something that he claims is happening in cartooning. So I'm kind of interested in pushing back on this notion of amplification through simplification, that only presence matters. Because I think, and this is something that Sugar has challenged us to think about by pushing back on the image of the pair of cartoon squirrels where the girl squirrel is demarcated by a ribbon and eyelashes, right? That absence is this force that has pushed back on a hypersaturation of presence as a mode of heterosexualization. And that absence is what permits fusion. It's what permits these embodied queer possibilities that Steven Universe imagines, because these bodies aren't tethered by the limits of heterosexuality or physics. And I call this sort of anti-amplification through simplification, this mobilization of absence in cartooned images, tracing by effacing, right? This idea that absence is in and of itself referencing its own existence, has a substance and a political momentum. And that's really become the guiding principle of my work and the book I'm working on about queer animation. And I really owe that to Steven Universe, because I don't see it as simply offering, which is also great, but representation in its own narrative sphere, but actually theorizing the cartoon image. So for me, and I'll stop talking in just a minute, because I think I'm over 5 minutes here. I see Steven Universe as not just offering this kind of representation for its own sake, but re-representing cartooning itself as an action that can be bent toward, or is already bent toward, the queer.
Having trouble with my own mute there. So I think that brings us then to Olivia.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Olivia Zolcek, and I am the Writing Center Coordinator at the University of Toledo. I also teach some select literature courses and composition courses at a few other universities. My research interests include intersectional feminism and anxiety within the supernatural and apocalyptic genres. And my chapter is titled I Am a Conversation, Gem Fusion, Privilege, and Intersectionality. So I take an intersectional approach to the representation of gender, race, and sexuality in the show. I spend a lot of time praising Steven Universe and its groundbreaking themes and characters, but I also recognize how the show both reinforces and complicates stereotypes of women and the different facets of their identities. I use Collins and Bilge's definition of intersectionality, as well as Halberstam's notion of Pixarvolt, to both praise and critique Steven Universe. Specifically, I showed that the crystal gems embody queerness, and the discourse surrounding the series engages in this revolt against heteronormativity, while also reinforcing the representation of intersectional identities. So I'll kind of just go over some of the things that I cover in my chapter. A significant portion of that close reads fusion subtexts that show the failure of intersectionality. I first analyzed Opal, the fusion between Amethyst and Pearl, specifically in the episode Giant Woman. And I find that Amethyst's status as this powerful hero is lost in this particular fusion. And the lead up to the fusion of Opal showcases how often Amethyst is dismissed as an equal contributor to the team. And I also argue that her erasure is indicative of the politics of race in America, where voices of Black individuals are silenced, and their representation is either lost or perhaps subjected to dominant stereotypes that ultimately perpetuate their oppression. So I also spend a lot of time on Garnet. Especially in these first few seasons, the show tends to reinforce dominant stereotypes of Black women in their bodies and their sexuality, especially in ways that undercut femininity, unless it's, of course, to meet the white male gaze. And I look at episodes such as Jailbreak, where it becomes apparent that Black queer femininity can only exist when it is juxtaposed to an even more masculine figure. And in this episode in particular, it is Jasper that I'm referring to. So another fusion that I analyze is Cellulite, where Garnet and Amethyst are subject to other damaging stereotypes of Black women, including the matriarch and the Jezebel. The representation of Cellulite is this large, highly aggressive and uncontrollable Black woman. And even more problematic in this episode that I referred to is the need to control Cellulite in a way that undermines her intelligence. And the only one able to accomplish this is Pearl. And a significant theme within that episode is being strong in the real way, focusing on intelligence rather than brute strength. And one of the last fusions that I analyzed is Sardonyx, who I believe further pronounces this white-Black divide, even though Sardonyx is literally a fusion between white and Black-coded characters. She represents both Garnet and Pearl in terms of physical appearance and weaponry and character. However, I feel that Sardonyx embodies entitlement and privilege, favoring Pearl's personality a little bit more. So to keep this a little bit brief, I don't want to go over my time, but my chapter ultimately argues that although Steven Universe has made so much progress in our conceptions of heroes and our conventional views of the world, and steering away from heteronormativity, there's still an important dialogue within those first couple seasons that remains within the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality.
I think I'm up next. If I can, I guess I'll just start. Okay. So I'm Jacqueline Ristela. I'm a PhD candidate in film and moving image studies at Concordia University, Montreal. And my chapter title was Globalizing Fandoms, Envisioning Queer Futures from Kunihiko Ikuhara to Rebecca Sugar. So generally speaking, my chapter looks at queer embodiment in Steven Universe and how it's influenced by the works of anime director Kunihiko Ikuhara. And so I find my chapter very much sort of in line with Kevin's, or sort of partially inspired by Kevin's, in that it's looking at the materiality of animation. It's trying to think about representation, not just in terms of narrative, but also in terms of imagery, in terms of the animation of what's happening in the series. So that's why my chapter primarily focuses just on embodiment, like what is happening to the bodies in these shows. This really emerged because the influences of Ikuhara were pretty explicit. Like there's a lot of fan analysis or fan tracing of the different influences, usually visual, like direct, like swordplay that's happening in Steven Universe is often sometimes like directly a reference to Ikuhara's series, Revolutionary Girl Utena. So fans had already kind of begun that tracing work. And so part of this chapter was sort of examining like, why is that? Why are we seeing that? And then there's also looking at what are the other influences that might not be as explicit, but that we can also see as working in Steven Universe. So the first section examines Sailor Moon, which Ikuhara directed some of the seasons of. And I talk about some of the magical girl influences in Steven Universe, but also how Steven Universe sort of adds a twist. So one of the things in Magical Girl series is the concept of henshin, which is the transformation from your normal self to your powered self, your magical girl self, and how this is often done through a device, right? Your henshin device. So it's either like a makeup object, or it's a wand or whatever. But in Steven Universe, it's interesting because the gems are very much their own henshin devices. So, and it's already embodied, like it's embedded in their bodies. So interesting sort of twists on, again, like a little embodiment of henshin going on there. Then I talk about Revolutionary Girl Utena, and really sort of two sections. First, thinking about how both series, both Utena and then Steven Universe, think about hegemony and critiquing hegemony. How do these shows kind of build up these systems of power and in order to critique them and to illustrate what are the ways, for instance, like patriarchy or empire of imperialism create a hegemony that tries to dictate what bodies look like, what gender expression looks like, that kind of stuff. And then the other section, I examine how the use of what we might call like weapons in Steven Universe is influenced by Revolutionary Girl Utena. So the imagery of pulling swords out of bodies is something that's a direct reference to Revolutionary Girl Utena. But again, there's like this mixing of the dissolving the boundaries of embodiment, or sort of blurring those boundaries, that the weapon is a part of you, that you can draw something that is normally seen as external, or a tool external to yourself that's actually inside you this entire time. And then the chapter ends with thinking about transnational circuits of fandom. So really thinking about how Ikuhara and Rebecca Sugar as creators are also fans. At the time of writing, Rebecca Sugar was really into Roland Barthes and talking about Roland Barthes in interviews. And so that's why part of this section kind of digs into that a little bit. If I was writing it now, I don't know how much I would do that anymore, because Rebecca Sugar hasn't really, I haven't seen recent interviews where Barthes is like a big figure in the interviews. But yeah, I'd have to think, maybe not, I'm not sure. But finally, I would say that this chapter was sort of an important stepping stone for my research personally, and sort of thinking of like, how does queer representation work in animation that isn't just narrative? Like, how do we actually think about the material aspect of animation, whether it be character design or character movement? And how is that, how do we see queer representation happening there as well? And that's my timer. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I guess, well, I'm John Ziegler. I'm an associate professor in the English department at Bronx Community College. And my research interests, I guess, aside from Steven, include early modern literature, and right now, a co-authored book on George Romero's films and a couple of zombie articles. So yeah, Leah, or do you want to introduce yourself now?
I guess that makes sense rather than pausing dramatically mid-discussion to introduce myself. I'm Leah Richards. I'm a professor of English at LaGuardia Community College here in New York. And my research, as I said, I do work with vampires as metaphors for contagion. Also co-authoring a book on the non-zombie films of George Romero. And yeah, what else do I do? Yeah, I write about vampires every time a friend of mine asks me to. So yeah, that's about it. And my Steven Universe tattoo is lapis lazuli, of course. So. I can't show mine.
Anyway, that was Paradap, not very visible on the screen there. But anyways, all right. So our chapter was about Ronaldo, and it was called, or is called, Truth is a Feeling in Your Gut, Ronaldo Fryman, Conspiracy Theories and Media Satire. So, you know, Ronaldo chronicles all the weird things that happen in Beach City. And he, in many ways fits the real world stereotypes of the American conspiracy theorist. He's relatively disempowered. He's young. He's a young straight male. He uses the internet to disseminate his interpretations and speculations about events, and he puts them forward as revealed truths. And as Steven Universe employs some of the trappings of science fiction, in science fiction, the believer in conspiracies is often the hero or becomes the hero. But Ronaldo doesn't really fit this template. And the franchise treats his immersion in conspiracy theorizing with ambivalence. Conspiracy theories are part of an attempt to feel a sense of political agency, and Ronaldo is susceptible to feelings of disempowerment. You know, he works at Deep Fryer, and when he's not doing that, he's investigating and publishing his findings and his theories. And we argue that the show consistently presents Ronaldo's theorizing as partly correct at best, and sometimes as leading to negative consequences. So his sense of self is shown to be tied up in his theorizing, and both his conspiracy theorizing and his sense of self are tied up in his narcissism. And so the result is a critical pastiche of this traditionally heroic sci-fi conspiracy theorist. So one of the episodes that we focus on, the most extensive in-show critique of this, is the episode Keep Beach City Weird. And Ronaldo claims in that episode that he's discovered that, quote, snake people or Sneeple control our government at the highest level. And rather than accept the gaps or errors in his theory, he instead tells Steven that, quote, truth is a feeling in your gut that you know is true. Truth is searching for anything that proves you're right, no matter how small, and holding on to that no matter what. I think we've seen this play out in the media in the past couple of weeks. And then Pearl provides the episode's thesis. She says, humans just lead short, boring, insignificant lives, so they make up stories to feel like they're part of something bigger. They want to blame all the world's problems on some single enemy they can fight instead of a complex network of interrelated forces beyond anyone's control.
Gee, thanks, Pearl. I feel seen. But so Steven Universe's representation of conspiracy theorists in the cartoon itself, and then in its real world Tumblr blog and book, Keep Beach City Weird, both of which are attributed to Ronaldo, it plays upon the lack of distinction between conspiracy theories and more mainstream models like celebrity gossip culture and internet fandom. In a 2014 Tumblr post, Ronaldo writes, in other news, Steven might be pregnant. Haven't been able to get him to take a Prager test yet, but I did snap this pic of him eating pizza. The pic shows a close-up of Steven's stomach adorned with arrows and question marks and labeled baby maybe. Ronaldo's blog post satirizes the conspiracy adjacent elements that run through celebrity culture. Both conspiracy and celebrity media discourses promise to confer privileged status upon the reader or participant by revealing to them some sort of secret information. Ronaldo identifies himself as a member of the privileged group in his pregnancy post. He writes, I was fooled yesterday, fooled into thinking Steven had an invisible pet lion. So stupid. I like to think of myself as a skeptical freethinker, so I'm surprised I believed such a silly idea. I think we've really learned to distrust skeptical freethinkers. So Ronaldo also often comes across like a surrogate for the fans. On his blog, he criticizes a fictional anime called Soul Blaster for its concentration on relationships over explosions. And this critique could also easily apply to Steven Universe. This parody of fan reaction is relatively mild compared to some real life examples. Co-executive producer Ian Jones-Quartey recalls fan reaction to the pilot being shared. He says, our then tiny fan base was positively outraged. There were accusations that Rebecca was selling out, rumors of Cartoon Network cutting the show's funding, that the show would look like early 2000s Flash animation, all kinds of stuff. People even tried to imply that the designs weren't actually Rebecca's work. So as with celebrity media, we again see the conviction that secret truths are being kept from the public by powerful organizations or individuals. Such fan behavior evinces the same feelings of disempowerment that drive conspiracy theorizing and the negative gossip of tabloid media, with the fans acting as producers in addition to consumers of the social capital of gossip. So more benignly, internet fan theories display an obsessive connection of apparently unrelated details to support a larger hypothesis, which is called forensic fandom. So all of this finally connects to the show's linking of disillusionment and maturity. Ronaldo's theories provide an analog and a parallel to Stephen's finding out more and more of the truth about his mother and her imperfections. Thanks. And next up, we have Justin.
Thank you. And thank you to Leah and John for putting this book together. There was one thing that was left out of the story of the book, which is that it was originally called Keep Beach City Weird. Very sad that that didn't make it into the final title, but these things happen. I'm going to, oh, okay, no screen sharing, so never mind. I had some pictures of Onion to share with you all, but I'll just talk you through it. So my chapter—
If you want to share them with me, send them in the chat, I can share.
Oh, that—
do an attachment.
I can make Justin co-host real quick.
Okay, yeah.
I won't abuse the power.
Please do.
Fabulous. So, is it working? Awesome. So my chapter focuses on Onion. I was very excited to examine him, both because I think he's just a really funny, interesting character, and also because I find this such a fascinating show from a representation perspective and from the way it portrays conversation and empathy. And he's such an outlier. And so I was kind of like, what is the deal with Onion? So if you look at Steven Universe, he's this super expressive, ebullient kid. And this is just a sampling of different facial expressions you get from him over the course of the show. Really, I almost selected them all from just one 2-minute clip, because he goes from overjoyed to terrified to so sad to angry to determined, all within the space of a few seconds. And he's constantly talking. He's talking about what he's feeling. He's talking with other people. He tries to resolve conflict and successfully resolves conflict through talking, which is sort of the thesis of the show, as culminates in the episode Change Your Mind. One reviewer calls it a sort of empathy superpower, which it may very well be, because all of his superpowers sort of revolve around love and empathy. And so with this as sort of the baseline for the show, Onion comes in and he looks like this. And in the show, in the top 3 panels, in one, he has just fired a harpoon into a boat, sinking it. In the middle top one, he has just been asked, "How are you?" And in the top right one, he's holding a mouse in his mouth that he's about to reveal. So you just look at Onion and he always has this completely blank expression. He does not speak for the most part. And when he does, it's in mumbling, indecipherable language. And so, unintelligibility, illegibility is politically very interesting, and also just within the context of the show, very funny. The way that Cheryl Glenn puts it in The Rhetoric of Silence is, expected silence can go unrecognized, but unexpected silences unsettle us. And Onion is nothing if not unsettling. And he's also funny. Joanna Gavins, in her book Reading the Absurd, puts it that absurd humor is a combination of the incongruity that is the source of humor when there's something incongruous comes up. So this silence counterposed with Stephen's expressiveness. And what makes it absurd is it's never really resolved. And so you never really understand what's going on with Onion. So then dialing that into the sort of politics and cultural messaging of the show, I started uncovering a lot about the Trickster figure. And in this book, Mythical Trickster Figures, which is more of an anthropological survey of trickster figures, they're described as fundamentally ambiguous and anomalous, which perfectly fits Onion. And in a more recent take on Tricksters, which is this book by Gabrielle Coleman on trolls, she talks about how trickster tales are not didactic and moralizing, but reveal their lessons playfully. Now, for a show that is very didactic, though in a very kind way, you never really understand exactly what Onion is trying to reveal to us, but that certainly seemed to fit the bill. So the other thing about trickster figures is they're kind of outlawish, outlandish, outrageous, out of bounds. And now this is a show that is about a huge wide array of identities that are considered out of bounds or outlandish or outlawish. So within that context, having somebody whose identity is so further out of removed is a kind of fascinating tension and resistance that is put even within the politics of the show. So if you look at Onion in lots of different situations, he is appearing suddenly in somebody's cabinet, has a mouse in his mouth, looks like kind of frightening, kind of mysterious, is regularly engaged in petty crimes that you don't really even understand the purpose of. So this sort of fits with the bill of the trickster, who is constantly kind of poking fun at and poking holes within the story and the arc of the argument that is being made. There's this really great quote, which is that the origins, liveliness, and durability of cultures require that there be a space for figures whose function is to uncover and disrupt the very things that cultures are based on. And I think this is kind of a beautiful way to talk about Onion. And this is a show that is about enlarging and enriching our perspective of what our culture is composed on through metaphorical and literal representation of all different kinds of figures and creatures and bodies. And within that, having even some further level of trickiness to the notion of representation that leaves it even more ambiguous. I think this harkens back a little to some stuff that Kevin was talking about, that it keeps everything open and alive and in play. So that in one of the later scenes in the show, when all the guests are gathered for a wedding and Steven says, gems, humans, lions big and small, living gourds. He's listing all these things, and there are multiple of all these things. And he says, Onion, who remains this outlier. And I think that's pretty much sums up his character. He also has a remarkable similarity to the pile of poo emoji, which was a footnote in the book that I was encouraged to expand into the text and just wanted to note. So, trickster, mystery, friend. Thank you.
Actually, as I recall, the peer reviewer said, like in the peer response, you have to include the emoji, no matter what it takes to be able to print it. You have to include the emoji. So next up, we have Emrys.
Yes, hello. My name is Emrys Donaldson. I use they, them, or he, him pronouns. I'm an assistant professor of English at Jacksonville State University in Jacksonville, Alabama. My academic focus is on writing with specialties in the short story, speculative fiction, that kind of thing. And my dogs will, of course, bark. So the chapter that I had in the book examined how power and consent really threads through the relationships between humans and aliens, not only in Steven Universe, but also in Lilith's Brood by Octavia Butler. And this was from her amazing Xenogenesis trilogy. These two texts really interested me because they both centered the stories of alien-human hybrid children who become emblematic of this reproductive futurity in both cases. And it's also kind of rare, I think, to find fiction or fictional stories of humans meeting aliens that really primarily engages with the difficulties of negotiating power rather than like immediately moving into something drastic happening. So I was really curious about that navigation of power, especially related to navigating consent, when in both cases the alien figures, so like the gems and the crystal gems, think of themselves as being much more capable and much more complex than humans are. So gems, of course, navigate this consent primarily through fusion and through this early season mystery of like how Stephen came to be. Butler navigates it also through human alien pregnancy. And I know a couple of other folks in the book have also, like you all have also talked about fusion and sort of what fusion is or how it works. In the article, I also talked about Donna Haraway, because she has a really interesting book that came out in 2007 called When Species Meet, that talks about this idea of like symbiosis and how, you know, we are always in conversation with other forms of life, even if it's forms of life like fungi or protists or bacteria or whatever, but that there's always a negotiation happening. So the hope for that is that examining these models in the text could inform other models for the diffusion of power in cross-species relationships. The article argues that communication norms enable this consensual symbiosis because they lead to a mutual respect and a sharing of power in Steven Universe. Sort of in contrast to what happens in Lilith's Brood, where reproductive labor of humans is really exploited, and like at some point aliens eat people. So it's very different. Yeah, so thank you, John and Leah, for organizing this, and yeah, cool.
Thanks. And next up is Evelyn.
Hello, everybody. I'm Evelyn Ramiel, and the chapter that I wrote came near the end of the process of putting all the pieces together, so I was able to read most of everybody else's pieces before I wrote mine, which was an advantage for sure. But what ended up happening was that I wanted to talk about an environmental topic, because I'm an environmental historian, PhD candidate at York University in Toronto. But what ended up coming out was that I really wanted a good excuse to use the official art book as a source. And what ended up coming out of that was an engagement with the background art of the show, and color composition were the things that I really ended up focusing on. So just to break it down into a few points, I'm gonna first sort of just talk about what I talked about, and then maybe address in like a minute or so what I would do differently if I wrote it now. So in the first little bit, I just want to go through first the basic idea of the show's ecological messaging, which, while not on the level of Captain Planet or anything like that, is fairly apparent once you begin to remember that most of the main characters are rocks that speak and have magic powers. And at one point, you know, when I'm going through the sort of narrative elements of this, really emphasize the fact that Steven Universe literally goes to the core of the earth and stops it from exploding by kissing it. So the geological environmental implications of this were pretty obvious, and I just had a lot of fun pulling them out. Basically, the show's sort of empathy superpower, as someone already put it, an emphasis on empathy as a kind of cure-all for social ills and interpersonal ills, extends to non-living things as well, and not just the sort of inorganic nature of the main characters, but also to the landscapes of the show, which are rendered in a way that the creators intended to basically confuse people who had a solid knowledge of how animation works. So they designed backgrounds so that certain elements would look like they might be animated, even if they were not able to move. So they were part of the static background, but were designed to create visual variation by kind of infusing a kind of the appearance of a potential to be able to move. They explicitly talk about this in the section on background art in the official art book, and I latched onto that pretty early as a sign that the production process itself for the show was interested in giving landscapes and geologies and topography a real say in how the story went forward. So a lot of my chapter is just looking at different background art. For instance, the gem birthing kindergartens with their virus-shaped injectors, and examining the way that tore up the Earth's surface, which is radically changed in the show. Once we finally get kind of macro views of the entire globe, we can see, for one, that the show takes place in somewhere around Delmarva, which I found very entertaining in itself, but more relevantly, that the entire Earth has been reshaped by previous ages of gem colonialism. And so a lot of the, so basically my entire chapter was just a way of tying all of those show's themes that everyone else had already talked about to the ecological core of the show, quite literally. And I found it really rewarding to get into that, because it's not something that I saw being talked about too much. And being a trans person in very close proximity to all those fan conversations on Tumblr, I was extremely exhausted with the gender and sexuality representation talk. So I really wanted to go in a different direction. But in any case, just to wrap up, as far as the question of how now would change how I wrote it, I'm not sure it would too much, except I might have had a little less enthusiasm for it just because of everything, and also because I didn't like Future very much at all. But I did have, I think that the fundamentals of the show's sort of engagement with ecology would have been more or less the same, particularly since the sources I was using were based on the first original series. But I definitely would have liked to engage with the movie a little bit, because the landscape alteration in that show is immediate and extremely dramatic, and I would have used that as a core example of how the show illustrates ecological themes instead of some of the examples I used, because it's just so visually potent, and it would have made for a great source for talking about this. But other than that, I think I would have been more or less good, even now, or at least the same as what I did before. So, but yeah, I did have a lot of fun writing it, and I really enjoyed writing my chapter. So thanks everybody. That's my spiel.
Thanks. So that brings us to Mandy.
Unmute myself there. Yes, hi, my name is Mandy Moore. I'm a PhD student at the University of Florida. I usually work on television, although I have a background in children's literature and children's media, so kind of do some crossover there. This chapter that I wrote for the book actually came out of a different project that I was working on, also on Steven Universe, for a special issue of Research and Diversity in Youth Literature on queer futurity. And I kept coming back to how colonialism fit into all of that, and it ended up needing to be a whole separate project. So my chapter is Off Color, Off Center, Decolonizing in Steven Universe. And the first half of the chapter, I really focus on kind of the things that Steven Universe does well when it comes to a decolonial praxis. So the show does do a lot of really good work to deconstruct colonial ideologies that intersect with other axes of oppression that also mirror real world oppression, so racism, homophobia, ableism, sexism, etc. So of course the main villains of the series are the diamonds, literal colonizers. So it's a very obvious anti-colonial message, but there's a lot of nuance throughout the narrative that helps to deconstruct the diamond's goals and the way that those goals influence all the other characters and affect them in traumatic ways. So the two main goals of the diamonds that kind of intersect with each other on a fundamental level are to maintain the hierarchies of gem culture and to reproduce and expand their empire, and those things go hand in hand. So I was working with some of the decolonial theory from people like Amiba Quijano, who describes a matrix of colonial power. It's not just brute force or direct physical violence. Colonial power operates in this matrix that influences and infiltrates every aspect of culture and society. The different pieces that he looks at are labor, intimacy, authority, and knowledge. And all of those we see influenced by the diamond's colonial ideologies in Steven Universe. So the first part, I'm kind of looking at the different trauma experienced by some of the characters, specifically garnet, amethyst, pearl, and then also the off-color gems that we meet in Homeworld. They literally live right in the underbelly of the gem homeworlds, cast out from society. And so with garnet, I talk about how her depiction shows intimacy being used as a colonial resource. With amethyst, I talk about beauty and ability standards being defined by colonial productivity. With pearl, I talk about internalized hierarchies of colonial ideology. And then with the off colors, all of those things are represented, but even more, they are literally being policed in space because they live on the gem homeworld. So that's all the first half. Those are all the ways that I think the show does a really nice job illustrating how these different layers of oppression are connected in a colonial paradigm. But in the second half, I kind of get into where their metaphor gets a little bit sticky for me, which is that it's not centering the perspectives of the colonized people, right? So one of the things you'll see is that in a lot of discussions of Steven Universe as an anti-colonial series, people always talk about the gems, the crystal gems kind of resisting the oppression of their colonizers. But the thing is, they're not the ones being colonized. The gems are the colonizers, right? And even the ones who defect from the gem empire are still coming from that colonizer perspective. So there are a couple of exceptions to this where the show does look at the effects on humans, the people who are actually colonized, and what that looks like for them trying to deal with the legacy of that. Steven is the obvious example, although I think for a lot of what Steven goes through, it has less to do with colonialism and more to do with him being Rose Quartz's son and having to deal with the legacy of that, although I think those two things are connected. But the other exception would be the zoo, the human zoo that they find in space, which is reminiscent of actual human zoos that were created by colonizers throughout history in really disgusting ways. So that's an exception as well, although we realize that the people who have been kidnapped in the zoo don't know that they have been kidnapped. They don't recognize that they have been taken away from their home. So in this way, I think the show, by focusing on how legacies of colonialism affect colonizers who have defected from the empire rather than on the colonized, it's a kind of tacit collusion with colonial ideologies that I don't think was intentional, obviously, but I think it's a good reminder of how even in anti-colonial and decolonial spaces and narratives, we can fall into these traps of creating story worlds where the focus is centering colonizer perspectives rather than colonized perspectives. So yeah, that's my chapter.
Thank you. And now we have Ellery.
Hi, I'm Ellery Thomas. I'm an archaeologist living in Southern Connecticut. I work at different museums, do like freelance history type things for various institutions. And I wrote about cultural memory in Steven Universe. When I first started writing this chapter, and when I initially proposed it for the book, I focused a lot on landscape memory. I am very interested in landscape memory in the show. I think there's still a lot to be explored there in a very real way, especially in the earlier episodes. The gem past really haunts the show's present, and it does that, I think, largely through like its landscape in the background. I think like probably the best example of this is the strawberry battlefield, which you see in some early episodes, which is sort of your first indication that there is like a major conflict in gem history, which I don't think you would have been made aware of prior to that episode. And I think that there's still a lot to be explored in terms of landscape memory, but as new episodes continue to come out during the development of this chapter, and as I had conversations with people about it, I found that really cultural memory and memory transmission and like individual memory and how these things play on each other really seemed like more central to the overarching theme of the show, especially when some of the final episodes of the original series came out. It just sort of seemed a lot more, I don't know, like a better focus for my chapter. So that is what I ended up writing about rather than landscape memory. So cultural memory, I took a course on cultural memory when I was studying as an archaeologist at University College London. It has a number of definitions. It's a kind of nebulous concept that, I mean, theorists use in like any number of ways. Some people are like, cultural memory is like only what governments have written about their own nation state, and that's like it. Or like, cultural memory is a very top-down process, whereas other people are like, cultural memory is literally anything. So I felt like it was important to sort of pin down what I meant when I was talking about it. And essentially, I wrote that cultural memory, for the purposes of this chapter, is the method by which people construct their sense of the past. It touches significantly on matters of identity, authority, and power. It concerns not only how a past is represented, but why it's integrated or ignored. It operates on micro and macro levels, in the family level, as well as like the nation state level. And it asks who wants whom to remember what and why. So those are aspects I looked at in Steven Universe when I was writing this chapter. The way information is revealed to the viewer is sort of the same pace at which it's revealed to Steven. So we have a very like intimate and up close experience of how the gems are constructing their cultural memory and identity and transmitting that to Steven. It's really interesting because in a lot of ways you can see them sort of like mediating their own personal and often traumatic memories in relating them to Steven and trying to make them like appropriate to whatever his age is at the time. So I just found, I found it really interesting that it sort of spoke to larger themes that have been present in a lot of other media properties lately, even other animations like in BoJack Horseman, for instance. It really spoke to themes of intergenerational trauma. And sort of the final piece of this chapter for me came talking with a friend of mine, Diana Foe, who's an editor, usually working in science fiction. And when I was telling her about the chapter, which was just about, which was in its final stages, she sort of pointed out that a lot of what I was talking about and a lot of the things in the most recent episodes, this was in like the beginning of 2019 when the final episodes had just aired. She mentioned that this sounded a lot to her like reconciliation, and the idea of like post-conflict reconciliation is something that she has like a unique take on as a Vietnamese American. And so we had some really fruitful discussion about that. And that informed the chapter quite a lot as well. So mostly I focused on the difference between vernacular or like individual and bottom up memory versus like top down as it's imposed by, for example, the Diamond Authority, and how the conflict between these two is sort of one of the central conflicts of the show, and how ultimately the reconciliation of these two opposing mnemonic forces is sort of the climax of the show, and that reconciliation is essentially the resolution. I don't think I would have written this very differently if I were writing it today. I wrote this obviously before the movie came out and before Future came out. And it was very exciting to see that a lot of the themes that I talked about were just like made explicit in the movie and in Future. And I was like, all right, okay, I feel good about this. I feel like Rebecca Sugar and I are like truly vibing at this time. Yeah. So felt very vindicated, felt very good. Probably would not change a lot. I think that's about all I have.
I actually should mention that we did send a copy of the book to Rebecca Sugar through a friend of a friend who works at Cartoon Network. And she was apparently delighted and really surprised that there was an academic book on it. And like the friend of a friend was like, yeah, there's an academic book on it. You created this tremendous masterpiece. But so Rebecca did get a copy of the book, if anyone was wondering. It occurred to me midway through this that as we were all trash talking the pandemic earlier and just how awful this is, the one pro to come out of this, when we were first talking about, oh, maybe we can try to do some sort of book event, we were hoping we might be able to pull, a few people like, could we get Ellery down from Connecticut? I think Justin, you're in the city, right? That we thought maybe we'd be able to get a few people in. Instead, yay pandemic, at least we were able to get everyone together for this so that we could all talk together about the book. So that's the one good thing. I will turn it over to Joseph, and I don't know if James is still here. Joseph, if you want to MC in any way, or let me and John know if you want us to do it.
I think we can just sort of let it happen as it happens. But how about questions and discussion now? If you are more comfortable, put them in the chat, and I will make sure they get directed to where they need to go. And if not, feel free to talk.
I guess we probably not so many of us, we can't just unmute. But I guess if we need to, we can always do the hand raising.
Yeah. I believe you can unmute yourself, no?
I have a comment for Jake. I'm so sorry to come at you with more a comment than a question as the first as the first thing here. I am, sometimes you become that guy. And I wanted to say to Jake that I deeply empathize with like looking back on things you've written, especially in an optimistic tone, and being like, oh, you beautiful idiot. But I think that your utopian ideas in this chapter are really necessary, even in 2020, and especially in 2020, because I think that it's only through contrasting our present experience with those kind of utopian ideals that we can really identify the issues with our current reality and with the current practices of social networks. So yeah, I wanted to say that I thought your writing was still timely and still important.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, I guess I would just say, like, you know, my current work is moving a lot into different ways to think about futurity in general. And so, you know, utopianism and hope and all those kinds of things are playing such a big role as you basically am putting together my dissertation, basically, and that's what it's kind of centering around. And so I'm constantly grappling with that of you know, both reckoning with things that I've done before and considering, like, am I being naive here? Am I being, or is this, as you say, like really something that is necessary in terms of envisioning what I want to happen and really having a critical stance towards that and maintaining that level of critique despite being so utopian, if that makes sense. Kind of in the way, you know, like Minos does. Like that's really my inspiration with that approach. So yeah, I mean, thank you for the comment. That's something I struggle with and something I'm hoping to make it through as I finish this dissertation. But yeah.
I'll just add quickly. Jake messaged me. Apparently, Rebecca Sugar is still talking about Roland Barthes in interviews. So maybe that section would still be the same. I think part of the thing with that section for me was like I had never really studied Barthes except for like Camera Lucida. So that was new stuff. So yeah, I don't know about y'all, but the book, writing for the book definitely pushed me in new ways and in productive ways too. So yeah.
Other questions or comments? Comments are fine.
I mean, I know there's a question early on in the chat from somebody about challenges. I don't know if that was directed specifically to one person or not. Challenges writing the chapter. I mean, I guess I would also, you know, I'd throw out, is there a successor to Stephen yet? Is it Kipo and the Wonder Beasts?
Is it She-Ra? That's
I was
what
gonna say She-Ra, yeah.
Yeah,
The Owl House.
Forget about She-Ra.
How could you forget about She-Ra?
Sorry.
I would second Owl House, actually, or Hilda, slash Summer Camp Island, actually.
Yes.
There's a whole branch, like there's like a half a dozen. So they're multiplying.
Yes. I think for me, one of the exciting things about Owl House in particular is that so many like cartoon kidult characters, like I think to SpongeBob, right? Like that's an important moment, both in animation and queer animation history, but also like this sort of idea of the kidult is reserved for male cartoon characters. And like you see that, you know, SpongeBob and Patrick get to do that. I think Owl House is really allowing the character of Ida to allow this sort of non-masculine kidult that I think is really exciting, and I'll shut up with that. But I think Owl House is doing exciting things there.
Mandy, Peter would like to go into your thoughts about how each of the gems is an aspect of colonialism. Each gem could be a whole chapter, Peter says.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. He's doing that to bother me. But yeah, it's one of the things I talked about that I found really interesting was with Garnet, how Cheryl Harris has talked about whiteness as property, right? The idea that whiteness is a kind of property. And if we're thinking about Garnet as a representation of both a queer and an interracial relationship, the sort of differences between two different kinds of gems and how that's breaking a taboo. It's not just breaking a taboo that, you know, the diamonds have instituted as part of their imperial hierarchy. It's also about like their gem status as being a kind of property, right? That Sapphire is sort of this noble elite gem, and her future vision and her elite status are property for herself, but also for Blue Diamond as sort of her as resources for Blue Diamond to make use of. And so for her to fuse with Ruby as this kind of interracial relationship becomes like a kind of taint to her property value as a gem. And so thinking about the way that race plays into Garnet as a sort of way that her intimacy is being seen as a resource for colonial power. So, one example.
I have a question for any of you who work more with animation. Just if you had any particular thoughts about, you know, the show did so much with anime tropes, but then with the movie, we switched to, you know, that really, really old school animation style and things like that. If anyone had any thoughts about what the movie did with changes to animation style, if anyone wanted to address that.
I mean, I don't have any really formed thoughts, but I would just like to maybe add on to your question, because I was sort of thinking, you know, earlier talked about how they're made of, you know, the idea that their bodies are made of light, animation is light, and so on. You know, that made me think of, you know, reading some horror theory, right? Citing the film theorists that argue that, you know, all characters on film are ghosts, right? So, you know, in that way that there's sort of that, she's sort of like kind of a ghost of past animation, but then all animation is spectral in some way. So I guess that I don't really have anywhere to go with that, but I just thought I'd add it into your question.
I think that's one of the really exciting things about Spinell in particular, is that she embodies this past tradition of animation that and Evelyn, you began to talk about this in the art book, right? But Rebecca Sugar talks about deliberately making this choice to design things off model as something that was like working within Fleischer Studios' method of drawing things. And that's like something I've struggled with in writing about this sort of lineage that Steven Universe is playing with, is because so many of these old cartoons, they're playful and they feature these trickster figures, but also like that tradition is directly steeped in blackface minstrelsy and other kinds of violence. And I think that really makes Spinell's simultaneous like playfulness and fun and like likability bounce off her tendency towards violence and her sort of her more destructive tendencies in a way that's exciting. And I think it also definitely presents a challenge, and I don't have an answer to that's perfect, because, you know, I think many of you here reflected a similar sentiment that like there's something, generally speaking, that's generative about this show for, you know, loosely construed progressive causes. But at the same time, like, how do we grapple with this tradition of animation as being grounded in an industrial blackface minstrelsy circuit and tradition?
Actually, I wonder if that takes us, is a segue kind of to a question that Emrys had asked too, that relatedly and read the present moment. I'm curious about y'all's thoughts on the Homeworld Gems as fascist, a characterization I discovered in the fandom. Thoughts? Yeah. I mean, I don't know that that had ever occurred to me, and now I'm like, why did that never occur to me? Yeah.
Yeah, it had never occurred to me either. And so apparently there is a small segment of the fandom that has become somewhat alienated from the fandom itself or from the show because of it. So I was really curious about what you all thought, if anyone had specific thoughts.
Yeah. I thought, I mean, to me, it felt very apparent, like watching the series, that there was very much like a fascism metaphor going on, especially like watching, thinking about the ways that institutions control cultural memory and how the Diamond Authority does the same thing. And fascism and colonialism having like tying into each other a lot. But I found it really interesting how there was definitely a portion of the fandom who took that in a very literal way and sort of were like, well, this show is bad because it tells you to befriend fascists or to reconcile with or to make friends with fascists, which I do understand as a point. But also, it is a children's show about like tolerance and understanding. So I think that to not have an ending that dealt with reconciliation in that way would sort of be counter to the entirety of the project. And, you know, dealing with real world fascism has very different implications, I think. And there's a lot more nuance to it, and we should respond to it, I think, very differently from how it was dealt with in Steven Universe. But also in Steven Universe, the stakes are so different because no one died. No one really died. No one can be said to have died except maybe for Rose Quartz, because everyone, even like the Shattered Gems, ended up sort of being able to be put back together ultimately through the reconciliation with the Diamonds, something that would not have happened if they had not reconciled. So the stakes, I feel, are very different, because it's not like there are, especially as you see in like the very end of the episode, it's not like there are lives that have been irretrievably lost, except again for Rose Quartz's, which was her choice.
I was actually reading an article like just before getting on to this meeting that made the case that oftentimes in children's cartoon, you'll either get a sort of implicit argument for remaining in this world of childhood or growing up and maturing, like it's either one or the other, and described how the show kind of straddles that divide and does a little bit of both. Like it tackles these huge themes of emotional maturity and political catastrophe. And there's also, like you say, like it keeps the stakes light at the same time, and it stays goofy, and it stays, it avoids getting too dark, I think, in a way that's kind of, yeah, nice.
I think it holds that balance until Future, where it starts yelling, grow up at the audience. But that's, I'm not going to snipe at it any more than that. I just wanted to get that out there because it's been rattling around in my head for a while. But yeah, I think that as far as the fascism question, though, it's there. It's there as much as it is in a lot of, you know, sci-fi that takes on sort of talking about the trappings of like galactic empires, from Dune to Star Wars. Any kind of like galactic empire inevitably carries those Nazi representation legacies forward, particularly when you have stuff like human zoos, rampant resource extraction. You have like the very direct, literal ways that White Diamond controls other people's minds and bodies and feels a sense of possession over the very like material of the universe. But ultimately, these characters are not like real fascists in that they like respond and change when confronted with evidence that they are hurting people and that their intentions are not as pure as they think. Ultimately, which I think definitely mean, you know, indicates that we're not dealing with Watership Down. We're not dealing with really direct metaphors or analogies for, or what's the word I'm thinking of? Allegories for fascism. So I don't agree with, I would not agree with people who would say it's like bad Antifa praxis to like how Steven Universe resolves problems.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, that's sort of going to be my point, like, too. Because and I guess I was just going to add, like, if you were to apply that, like if you were to apply Umberto Eco's, like, fascism, like, to what extent, you know, can we see the homeworld empire? And, like, some of them certainly maybe map on, but there are others that don't, right? Like, so I feel like, I think the certain aspects of the or certain portions of the fandom's maybe obsession with like this term is maybe misguided. Like I don't know how productive it is to like latch onto it, and especially when it comes to the conclusion as, again, like, this is bad Antifa practice. When it's like, well, that wasn't really the intention. Are we going to say Star Wars is bad Antifa practice? Or whatever, like, you know, Dune is bad Antifa, or like, I don't know, you could go through, but anyway, yeah.
I was going to say that, and I think Star Wars actually does the same thing. You know, what kind of dilutes the fascist part of the allegory a little and makes it maybe easier to be friends with them, you know, is that they insert the family element. So that makes it almost, it's as much monarch, you know, Steven Universe, right? It's as much like, you know, Queen Elizabeth overseeing the British Empire, right, as it is, you know, an actual sort of authoritarian government, which also makes it, you know, when the family is the government, that also makes it easier to change the government, perhaps.
I think go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. I think that there are viewers who take exception to that as well, and that they're like, well, so White Diamond is basically like an abusive mother or abusive grandmother, however you want to. So are you saying that I should reconcile with my abusive mother or grandmother? Fuck you. I'm sorry. Are we allowed to swear in this? It's fine.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a question I wondered too late. But I do wonder if the sort of didactic tone of the show that we've talked about sort of contributes to fans thinking in this very like literal way. I would say that probably it does. But again, I don't think that's necessarily what the show is saying. I also wanted to note that I feel that Future is less about growing up, as you said, Evelyn, and more about sort of trauma recovery. And that these things can be related, but that ultimately it's about sort of expanding on the themes of like how to deal with memory in a way that is productive. Like, it just feels to me as rather than a departure, as just an extension of that theme that's very much present in the show before that.
I agree with that. Not only navigating trauma, but just navigating change in general as part of that shift to teenager adulthood. It's just one of those, again, another one of those really real things that I think Rebecca Sugar tries to address. So
there was something else. I read some interviews with her after Future was done, and she said apparently I had never seen the like full version of the intro song. And Steven's line at one part is like, I'm trying to be what everybody needs me to be and wants me to be. And she's like, that should have been everybody's sign that Steven was working too hard. And I was like, I never saw that, but you're right. And I think it was part of the idea of that was to open up a window into the sense that like Steven, despite seeming constantly happy-go-lucky and kind of like pure emotive soul, like a lot of what he's doing is kind of performing based on what he feels responsibility to, like to fill the shoes of Rose Quartz and to like the way that the gems are all sort of subtly looking to him to address things. And so it was kind of, I guess, uncovering the roots of that dynamic and how that plays out when he gets older, which I was totally flummoxed by and had not picked up on at all. So I don't know.
There's in the chat, there's a question, how do we extend this, what we've been talking about to Greg's racist and homophobic brother and his forgiveness? Any thoughts?
I think to return to, I forget who just said it, but I think it was Ellery was saying, like, I think it's a good moment to not take the show as like literally instructive as like, you must follow this model. I think it's a lot of the show is not necessarily, and it comes across as very didactic, maybe more so for those of us who are out of the age range of Steven Universe, that it seems like, oh, I can see how they're trying to instill this lesson. But I think at that age, you're just trying to open the possibility that, oh, this person who seems cantankerous or shut off or aggressive or hostile, there might be some way to get access to them. And so I think it's like, it's a very hopeful and, positive way to wrap up that storyline. And it's very sweet, as is the case with most of the show. And maybe it's another good reminder of ways that the show, despite like inviting being taken very literally, not always take it so literally.
I mean, I think too, there's the reminder building off of this, there is not a human being in this Zoom call or possibly in the world who is Steven. None of us is that kind, or maybe you are. Okay, I am not that kind. I am not that empathetic. I am not that willing. But for someone, if someone is Steven, raised in this way, in this world of pure tolerance by, his any number of aunties, raising him to be this wonderful empathetic creature who has this superpower of empathy, even that, yes, for him, for a person like that, everyone can be forgiven. Maybe that's, a little bit biblical there or something, but normal people, the fact is everyone watching the show was like, oh my God, is he, he's going to forgive. Oh my God. Because we can't do that because we are not him. Again, not that we should take it literally, but I think there is a reminder in that too, that he is a better person because he is made up, perhaps, that he can be a better person than most people are, better in the sense of more forgiving, even of the intolerable.
Yeah, I would just quickly add on to that. I find this really interesting. A little more than a year ago, I interviewed Rebecca Sugar and asked her directly about this perception of the show as, being partly about, anyone can be redeemed or anyone can be forgiven, or that so many character arcs are about that kind of progression. And she really pushed back on me about that. She was surprised that was a thing that people were seeing in the show. And she kind of, she argued to me that there are, cases where that doesn't happen, and there's characters like Jasper where maybe it seems like that's what's happening, but it's really a more complex thing, and that in the movie and in future as well, it's about Stephen kind of reckoning with the limitations of that kind of what you were just talking about, Leah, but that kind of super empathy or whatever, how that has its limitations, and about how that isn't always maybe the best path to go on. And so yeah, I thought that was interesting because I came into that conversation with her having that perception of the show as being about this kind of utopian, super empathetic world that doesn't actually exist, and it's been presented as a place that why wouldn't you create a place that doesn't have hate or doesn't have whatever. But yeah, I was surprised she pushed back on that and made me rethink kind of how a lot of those arcs do actually end up going, especially in the movie and in future. So yeah, I thought that was interesting.
As just throw in one small point, maybe, that I think there's a valid critique to be made of sort of the trope of, if you just get to know X, you'll be, because that's abstract empathy is much more important, right? You're not going to meet every type of person or animal or what do you say, or protid that you should be empathetic with. I suppose on the other hand, it's hard to dramatize and that sort of abstract internal process. But I think there is something to be said in criticism of that as a trope.
I feel like some of this speaks back to that earliest question about what was hard about writing this chapter, and the temptation to take it very literally and to just sort of be like, oh, I'm basically just elucidating a theoretical argument that is being made in an animated form, and be like, well, so then how am I, what is my argument that I'm contributing to that? Because it comes across, I think that reading is, again, like so easy to fall into. And I found it very enlightening, like Jake was talking about, when I would read things that Rebecca Sugar had said that had pushed back on that interpretation.
I mean, I think that's too, going back to the idea of even breaking down the backgrounds, breaking down the literal representational mechanisms, is, it's important to keep those perspectives too. I think like we see that a lot in video game studies, right? Everyone sort of treats video games as like this, like a novel, like a narrative, and you see what the symbols are and whatever, and that's the most common approach. But, looking at the actual mechanics, and, if you strip away all the narrative, how is it working, I think is really important too.
I guess any questions from audience or contributors, other questions for one another? I mean, I guess we've kind of already, through the exchange of the various possible successors, we have, the possible backup question of, okay, so what are you watching now that, Steven Universe is over? I think we kind of answered that.
I already said it in the chat, but I really want to give another shout out to Craig of the Creek, because it really got me through this year, guys. It's a good show. It's a really good show. It's like, it's very the sort of like stylized way that it presents some of the conflicts, like just really speaks to some like very big emotional truths of like being a child. Real good. Also, the musical episode is very catchy. It slaps. It's good. Yeah.
I mean, I'll throw in, I was thinking before when we were talking about that stuff, like, you know, Summer Camp Island and all the Cartoon Network shows, except I think Craig, have been sort of ported over now to HBO, which, you know, how will that affect, you know, the fan communities, and, you know, are fewer people even going to see them? You know, even leaving aside the cost, now it's buried, you know, Summer Camp Island is buried in the rows and rows of random stuff that Warner Brothers owns. You know, so it'll be, I don't know, you know, is that going to make it harder to have another Steven Universe happen with, you know, something that gets such sort of widespread attention?
I think it'll happen, but it won't be anything we're like looking for. Yeah. So this stuff will just sort of coalesce, and we'll all be like, "Whoa, what happened?" But it is true. I am kind of disappointed that Summer Camp Island is behind what is it, $15 a month paywall. Although there are other ways to watch it, obviously. But that is the like most obvious one, and the one, you know, luckily I've been able to do because my partner's doing research on Warner media properties and needs one for research purposes, and needs a subscription for research purposes. And so yeah, I mean, I would also recommend, if people want to get into the Japanese side of like good semi-therapeutic children's entertainment, Precure is just starting, the Precure franchise is just starting to get officially moved into English. So if you have Crunchyroll or, you know, other means of accessing anime beyond comprehension or polite discussion, you can definitely get into Precure or shows like that, like the like magical girl shows that are aimed more either more at children or at teens. I think you're going to find a lot of the same stuff, just presented in a different idiom. Probably won't be as good as a conversation piece because most people haven't interacted with it yet. But hey, you never know what will catch on. So I always like just to keep my eyes open for everything coming out.
Any other questions or anything? We're nearly at the time that we allotted, but we didn't actually think, I don't think we knew for sure if we'd go this long, but this has been a great conversation. You know, if I ever, you know, think about putting together another book of, you know, another academic book on a children's cartoon, I will be sure to contact y'all. Yeah.
How do we get a recording of this? If you'll just make sure Leah or I have your email, we can get it. I mean, it'll be going up on YouTube. You can just search the BCC English department on YouTube and you'll find it there. So.
I think we've had silence for just long enough that this has been fantastic. Again, a high point of the pandemic, getting to get all of us into a space together to talk about this. Maybe keep in mind that, yeah, things like this are an option, because I think, yeah, next edited collection I work on, this is a very fruitful way of bringing ideas together. Well, on behalf of the co-sponsors, LaGuardia Community College's English Department, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Committee, the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies option, the Women's Center and LGBTQ Safe Zone Hub, and Bronx's
ECC English, as well as the resource room at Bronx Community, the LGBTQIA resource room at Bronx Community College. On behalf of all of them, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Great to meet everyone. Thanks to all the writers, all the audience members. This was great.
This was a lot of fun. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye, everyone. Be well.
Bye. Zoom wave.
Bye.
Stopping recording. Yes, I want to stop.